This is for an audio cassette of My Solitary Elegance. I am Jane Austen. I have been really very lucky. God endowed me with a satirical faculty which never slept, and too often would not let me sleep. I've frequently lain awake all night with the noises of the conversations I've listened to during the day jangling in my head, all that was discordant or abrupt or harsh or monotonous or clumsy or needlessly repetitious. There was no shutting it out. Writing it down and laughing at it has been my only relief.
In April, the Daily Express informed us that Jane Austen's novels are heading for a revival. On Easter Monday, television gave us a new film of Persuasion. In the autumn, television brings us Pride and Prejudice. Beyond that comes a film of Sense and Sensibility, and of course, the usual cascade of books, some rather less welcome than others. Least welcome of all, I suspect, will be a trilogy, Jane and the Unpleasantness at Scargrave Manor. That's due out next spring, to be followed by Jane and the Man of Cloth, followed by Jane and the Curse of Brahma. These unlikely titles feature Jane Austen as a Regency detective. There are 3 books we really can welcome, all from members of the committee. First, Jane Austen and Food by Maggie Lane. Secondly, the Jane Austen Cookbook by Maggie Black, the London branch, and Deirdre Le Fay. And thirdly, the new edition of Jane Austen's Letters.
Well, I became so much interested in Jane Austen in the way that anybody does who reads the novels. They were so absorbing. One read them and reread them and reread them. And then I was longing to find a book which would tell one, give one a chronological account of her life, taking in the novels as well, and I could not find one. All the books seemed to have titles like Aspects of Jane Austen or Jane Austen, Her Homes and Friends and so on. So I suppose in the end, it sounds rather bumptious, but I wrote the book that I'd been trying to find.
I think the reason why there's a constant outpouring of works and criticisms and commentaries and biographies of Jane Austen is the enigma of the woman. I mean, her works are generally regarded as being among the greatest works in English literature. They have a universal appeal, they have an enduring appeal, and yet this woman appeared to live the most narrow, constricted, provincial, isolated life.
She's mysterious as a genius is, because really we cannot say why this particular young woman drew from her genes, her parents, from her reading, from her family life, why it is that she was able to make these great works.
Good morning. I'm Deirdre Le Fay. A few years ago, I wrote Jane Austen, A Family Record, which is the definitive factual biography about Jane Austen and her family. And I have just finished and published the latest 3rd new edition of her collected letters. Now, the slide we have on at the moment is where it all began. This is the site of Steventon Parsonage. In the green field, now empty, there was once Steventon Parsonage, and Jane was born there in 1775. And the parsonage was unfortunately pulled down some years later, which is why it's now just pasture.
We think that the parsonage was on this site, and in fact this pump
was probably in the yard of the house. And there's an amusing story about it, because for years, all people who came to see where Jane Austen was born thought that this pump was the original one. But it was removed, apparently, in the 30s, I think, and a later pump was put there. And then in the bicentenary of Jane Austen's birth in 75, it was pinched. And so what is there is only the base of the pump that was in the yard of the parsonage. She herself, of course, wouldn't have probably ever used it because the servants would have done that. But that's all we have left of the original parsonage, because her brother and her nephew didn't think it was grand enough when the brother became rector here. And so they built this rather grand house overlooking the village.
My dear Anna, your Aunt Cassandra and I have been very much amused by your book, but I have a good many criticisms to make. Mrs. F. going into a neighbourhood where she knows nobody but one man is an awkwardness which so prudent a woman would not be likely to fall into. Give her a friend, and let that friend be invited to meet her. You are now collecting your people delightfully. 3 or 4 families in a country village is the very thing to work on.
In a village like Steventon here, there'll be far more than 3 or 4 families. I mean, there'll be 3 or 4 gentry families, which is the world that she tells us about. But 90% of the population of a village like Steventon would be illiterate farm labourers. Mary Bennet, who you find in the parish register, was illiterate. She was extremely promiscuous. She had illegitimate children every other year. There's also a William Collins, who was another illiterate farm labourer. Now, you find Mary Bennet and William Collins in Pride and Prejudice. And we have plenty of evidence that her childish imagination was fired up by some of the things that she found in the parish register. Of course, her father was the vicar of his parish, and he was the man who made the entries in the parish register. In the specimen for the banns of marriage, she entered her own fantasy marriage. It says, Edward, Arthur, William Mortimer of Liverpool and Jane Austen were married in this church. One of the things most people don't realise is that George Austen was actually, relatively speaking, quite poor. When he married Cassandra Lee, Jane Austen's mother, it's evident that for Cassandra Lee this was really a step down in social terms. He was actually rather afraid of bringing her here to Steventon. For the first few years of their marriage life, rather than bringing her here, he hired the local pastor in the next parish at Dean, which is actually a big mistake, because they arrived there and it rained for 6 months without ceasing, and the whole parish was flooded. They were able to pick fish out of their back garden. But he then brought her to the parsonage here at Steventon, and it was rather a cramped place. This is not a wealthy family. There were various things which they did in order to economise. She was married in a red, hard-wearing woolen riding suit, which became her daily wear for the next 2 years. And even after that was subsequently cut up and used for a riding jacket for her eldest son. There are various other ways in which George Austen sought to eke out his stipend, particularly in his connections with Warren Hastings, who was the Governor-General of Bengal. Warren Hastings himself, of course, was a very controversial figure. When he came back from India, he was impeached for corruption, and it was one of the most celebrated trials of the latter part of the century. It went on for 9 years in the House of Lords. And throughout that period, the Austens were great defenders of him. I mean, during his period as Governor-General, he would be sending back chests of opium and of gold and of diamonds and so on. And George Austen and other members of the Austen family are negotiating these for him and making the money for him out of these transactions. And obviously it's a very lucrative arrangement for the Austen family to be involved in.
She was the 7th of 8 children, 6 brothers who mostly became very successful in life, and one devoted elder sister, her sister Cassandra, to whom, in fact, most of her letters that we know about were actually written.
She was said to be prettier than Jane. She was obviously a self-effacing woman, Cassandra protected Jane, it is quite clear. Cassandra took on a larger part of the household burdens and the wear household burdens. Part of the education of little girls then was sewing. They sewed their brother's shirts, they did the cooking, they helped with the garden. But it is clear, as the years went by, that Cassandra did more, and Jane was protected by Cassandra, and their love for each other was great and endured to the last day of Jane's life, and, of course, beyond. Her father collected books, and her mother was a great reader, and they all read novels. Her father had, I think, 500 volumes in his library by the time she was grown up. They put on plays. They were very, very active amateur dramatics. She was educated like that. Her father gave her a French grammar when I think she was only 8 years old. She had an Italian book. She was obviously very clever.
Every thought was now engaged by the horrid spectacle before us. 2 gentlemen, most elegantly attired, but weltering in their own blood, was what first struck our gaze. We approached. They were Edward and Augustus. Yes, they were our husbands. Sophia shrieked and fainted on the ground. I screamed and instantly ran mad. We remained thus mutually deprived of our senses some minutes, and on regaining them, were deprived of them again.
The next door village to Steventon was Dean, where her father was also incumbent, and this is the very nice Dean house, which was owned in Jane's time by a family called Harwood, who'd owned it for many generations, and as you see, it still survives. And she talks about going to visit the Harwoods and having dances at Dean House, so that was where it was.
Tom Lefroy is a very gentlemanlike, good-looking, pleasant young man, I assure you.
She writes about him to Cassandra with some excitement. And this relationship is sometimes dismissed as not having been serious, but I think she may have been quite serious about him. She writes about him in this very jokey kind of way, but then she would, because I think her pride would prevent her from going on about it in a more serious way. But I think she may have had hopes.
Her elder brother Edward, who was a silver spoon in the mouth young man, was adopted in his teens by some distant and rich cousins, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Knight of Godmersham, and Edward left Hampshire and went to live in Kent. While he was in Kent, he met the very large family of Sir Brooke Bridges, who lived at Gunston, and he married one of the Bridges' daughters.
Jane Austen quite often visited this house. And we have letters from her to her sister describing her visits, how she arrived at this great and beautiful brick house, and how they would clear the rooms for dancing after supper, and how she made friends with her brother's relations and cousins. It was a very family atmosphere there. The hostess was this wonderful woman, Lady Bridges, whose portrait is still hanging in the walls of the drawing room, where no doubt Jane Austen danced. And she was the mother of Elizabeth, who married Edward. Well, then, after Edward had married Elizabeth, they went and lived in a house only a mile away, called Rowling. It was one of the estate houses of the Bridges family. And it was in that house, Rowling, Jane Austen began to write. And she was only at the age 20, 21, 22 years old when she drafted the first versions of Pride and Prejudice, and Northanger Abbey, and Sense and Sensibility. And there's no doubt at all that she took her work with her when she went visiting. And it was in this beautiful little white house that many of our most favourite scenes and characters were conceived and realised in the rooms upstairs.
Having had several children at Rowling, Edward's adoptive father died. And in 1797, he became the owner of this very fine house, Godmersham Park.
My dear Cassandra, Our brother was walking before the house as we approached, as natural as life. Fanny and Lizzie met us in the hall with a great deal of pleasant joy. We went for a few minutes into the breakfast parlour and then proceeded to our rooms. It seems odd to me to have such a great place all to myself. In the meantime, for elegance and ease and luxury, I shall eat ice and drink French wine and be above vulgar economy.
If I were you, I would not allow them anything yearly.
I think you are right, my love. A present of £50 now and then.
To speak the truth, I do not believe your father had any idea of giving them money. He only meant you to help them in kindly ways now and then.
Such as a basket of game or fish when they're in season.
And helping them to find another dwelling place.
Upon my word, I believe that is exactly what my father meant.
She never forgot money. She would never sort of shrink from the fact that people thought about, again, how much they had, how much they were marrying their daughters for, and where they stood in the world. And as everybody thinks like that all the time, and always has, of course, she was instantly understood and popular. And I think that's where her genius lay, that she could be completely vulgar. He's only got 5,000 a year, you know, whatever, as well as being tremendously understanding and imaginative.
And is that why she's still popular today?
Yes, I'm sure it is. I don't think anything ever changes in that way, really. Of course, people don't talk like that. They don't say, what a shame, my daughter's marrying somebody who's only earning a week. But if you actually listen to in-laws talking about a coming wedding, and after all, Jane Austen's novels are about people getting married, about daughters getting married, you'll find it comes down to that within half an hour of them all meeting.
Cousin George was very kind and talked sense to me every now and then in the intervals of his more animated fooleries with Miss Bendish, who's very young and rather handsome. There was a monstrous deal of stupid quizzing and commonplace nonsense talked, but scarcely any wit.
I have a great deal of sympathy with her attitude to some of the things that are going on around her. What you have to remember is that Jane Austen was a single woman, a brilliantly talented woman. In the periods when she was writing, she was quietly turning herself into a great novelist, and she must, on some level, and have been aware of who and what she was. And she's living in a society where any married woman automatically has a superior status. And I would imagine she got rather fed up with always having to be thrilled every time someone got married, while what she was quietly achieving was not the subject of any attention at all.
Mr. Darcy, since last April, my sentiments have undergone so material a change as to make me receive your present assurances with gratitude and pleasure.
In 1801, Jane's father decided to retire from his country parish, and they all moved to Bath, and they lived at various addresses in Bath.
Her father and her mother simply made this decision to leave Steventon, which she adored, and go to Bath, which she hated, and simply announced it to her as a fait accompli. And the story is that she actually fainted when they told them. Cassandra is supposed to have removed the passages of letters in which she expressed her true feelings about this. But if you look a bit further, they sold her piano, they sold most of the books. She was then in her 20s, and so she had her whole life simply carpet drawn from under her feet. She must have felt very powerless.
They had to look for a house, and that was the big question, how much they could afford, whether they could live in one of the more fashionable areas of Bath, and they did a lot of house hunting. Mrs. Austen was particularly interested in Queen Square, where they'd had a very happy holiday. Mr. Austen liked the side of the river in Bathwick, down Great Pulteney Street, which was a level approach to the city and rather expensive and exclusive houses. And in fact, that is where they ended up. At the end of 3 years, in fact, they had to leave that house, probably because they couldn't afford to remain there. And then they took a house in Green Park Buildings.
if you look at her work, she had, in the 1790s, at Steventon, done a first draft of Sense and Sensibility, which was called Eleanor and Marianne, and a first draft of Pride and Prejudice, which was called First Impressions, and a first draft of Northanger Abbey. And then they go off to Bath, and really, then, for 10 years, nothing much happens. And, of course, to her, it must have looked as though things were quite grim.
His instructions were so clear that she soon began to see beauty in everything admired by him, and her attention was so earnest that he became perfectly satisfied of her having a great deal of natural taste. He talked of foregrounds, distances and second distances, side screens and perspectives, lights and shades, and Catherine was so hopeful a scholar that when they gained the top of Beechin Cliff, she voluntarily rejected the whole city of Bath as unworthy to make a landscape.
Her social life was dependent to some extent on her aunt, Mrs. Lee Perrott, and her aunt's friends, and Mrs. Austen and the two daughters had to mix with these ladies, which Jane Austen found rather dull, staid people.
I cannot anyhow continue to find people agreeable. I respect Mrs. Chamberlain for doing her hair well, but cannot feel a more tender sentiment. Miss Langley is like any other short girl, with a broad nose and wide mouth, fashionable dress and exposed bosom. Admiral Stanhope is a gentleman-like man, but then his legs are too short and his tail too long.
She had this kleptomaniac aunt, Lee Perrott, who was tried for stealing from a haberdasher's in Bath. And this became really rather a celebrated trial. And Mrs. Lee Perrott really only got off from the charge because there was a sort of establishment desire that she should. The judge didn't actually allow the jury to retire from the box because it was perfectly clear what verdict they had to bring in and so on. But had she been found guilty, she would have been transported. That line between this polite and fashionable world that Jane Austen inhabits and the more dangerous social world is quite a thin one.
Now, while they were at Bath, they made the famous trip, as it is now, to Lyme Regis in 1803 November, and they went back again in the summer in 1804. And these slides show specifically the references mentioned in Persuasion. I took them all quite deliberately. This is the Cobb hamlet, and in Persuasion, the Harvilles were supposed to be renting a tiny little cottage here.
She appears always to have loved the sea and its associations, partly because two of her brothers were naval men, Francis and Charles. And then there is a passage in Persuasion which is the nearest she ever got to purple prose. It's an effusion. For Jane Austen, it's definite effusion, which describes the approach to Lyme Regis.
Anne and Henrietta, finding themselves the earliest of the party the next morning, agreed to stroll down to the sea before breakfast. They went to the sands to watch the flowing of the tide which a fine southeasterly breeze was bringing in with all the grandeur which so flat a shore admitted. They praised the morning, gloried in the sea, sympathised in the delight of the fresh-feeling breeze, and were silent.
Now, the famous Cobb itself, which always gets talked about, that is the last remaining very rough staircase down from upper level to lower level. This is known as Granny's Teeth. I apologise for the municipal rubbish bins also visible, but I didn't feel I could try and make the effort to drag those away. Some people say it can't be the one that Louisa Musgrove is supposed to have jumped from, but if it wasn't this one, I think it must have been something very like it. And as it is the only surviving one, I felt that was as good a reason to take a photo of it as any.
Catch me.
Louisa, be careful. There.
Louisa, stop.
Too high, Louisa. Louisa, it's too high. Louisa, that is too high.
I am determined, Captain.
Louisa, do not be so foolish!
Louisa,
When the family was in Bath, between 1800 and 1809, they went on seaside holidays every summer, and letters seem to indicate that the summer of 1801, it was Sidmouth that they went to. Caroline Austen, who was a niece of Jane Austen's, much later on, she was talking to Cassandra, well after Jane was dead. And Cassandra, at the age of 55 or so, had been reminded by a young man they'd seen, a very good-looking young man, who was then reported to have died suddenly. And this had jolted her memory and said, that's terribly like something that happened to my sister and I when we were at the seaside. I'll just read you this little piece. This is from Caroline. During the few years my grandfather lived at Bath, he went in the summer with his wife and daughters to some seaside. They were in Devonshire and in Wales, and in Devonshire an acquaintance was made with some very charming man. I never heard Aunt Cassandra speak of anyone else with such admiration. She had no doubt that a mutual attachment was in progress between him and her sister. They parted, but he made it plain that he would seek them out again, and shortly afterwards he died. My aunt told me this in the late years of her own life, and it was quite new to me then. Now, it would be very odd for Caroline to make that up, and Cassandra as well was not fanciful from all accounts, so it does seem very likely. There was this one summer where she met somebody who at last seemed right for her, and that she would have been able to accept.
There are such beings in the world, perhaps, my dear Fanny, 1 in 1,000 as the creature you and I should think perfection, where grace and spirit are united in worth, where the manners are equal to the heart and understanding. But such a person may not come in your way. Or if he does, he may not be the eldest son of a man of fortune, the brother of your particular friend, and belonging to your own county. But anything is to be preferred or endured, rather than marrying without affection.
The letters stop between May 1801 and September 1804. And it's an unusual gap, and it's been suggested they were destroyed by Cassandra, perhaps because they give details of this supposed love affair.
I think that if she'd never been in love, she wouldn't have been able to draw people like Fanny Price, indeed, and Elizabeth Bennet, who, after all, when she thought it was too late, found that she was hopelessly in love with Mr. Darcy. I think the pictures of women in love, and Emma too, they are so accurate and true. I don't know whether men think so, but I think women recognise it as absolutely true.
I can't imagine what kind of wife she would have made. I think she would have been fairly acerbic. And although there couldn't really have been a divorce, I think there might have been quite a lot of time spent apart, as they might have put it in those days. I can't imagine that a Mr. Darcy type of man would have been much of a pleasure to Jane Austen, because she would have been irritated by the grandeur and the aloofness precisely of those heroes like Mr. Darcy. And I think, as in Persuasion with Wentworth, he was just a bit wet. I think she would have thrown him out, really. So it's hard to imagine her marrying.
In December 1802, she was visiting with Cassandra. She was visiting back in Hampshire, the house of people they knew very well. The 3 sisters there were her best lifelong friends. And the son there at this house, he was 21 at the time, and Jane Austen was 26, 27. And he proposed marriage to her. Apparently he was quite an awkward, sort of stuttering type, and contemporary account says nothing to recommend him but his size, which makes me laugh. And but she accepted him, and then overnight changed her mind, and the next morning left with her sister in great distress and lots of tears, and having turned him down. And his name was Harris Bigwither. I sometimes wonder whether that might have had something to do with it as well.
You didn't get married yourself. Do you relate yourself and your own life to Jane's?
Well, I do not, and I would never presume to say that I could relate my mind to Jane Austen's in any respect whatever. I'm afraid I simply am the non-marrying kind. I don't want somebody to be there the whole time. And that's a very nice woman said to me not long ago, well, but you must have had affairs, haven't you? And I said, well, yes, I did, but I mismanaged them. And she said, oh, we all do that. It was very comforting, really.
This is Green Park Buildings West, another quiet street in Bath. Many people will tell you that Jane actually lived in a house in this street. And my researches show that, in fact, she did not. She lived in what was a very similar house, but in the other side of the road, Green Park Buildings East, which was demolished in the Blitz, unfortunately, and it has been rebuilt in this rather depressing 1960s post-war style. I think it's old people's housing, something like that.
Green Park Buildings, 21st of January, 1805. My dearest Frank, I have melancholy news to relate, and sincerely feel for your feelings under the shock of it. I wish I could better prepare you for it, but having said so much, your mind will already forestall the sort of event which I have to communicate.
When her father died, there's a letter she wrote to her brother, very beautifully worded letter, describing the last couple of days of her father's life, and a tribute to what a wonderful father he was. She then discovers that the brother in question has moved. I mean, she gets a letter from him saying he's not at home, he's in Portsmouth, and so she has to do the same thing all over again, and there's a second letter.
To Captain Austen, HMS Leopard, Portsmouth. My dearest Frank, your affectionate heart will be greatly wounded, and I wish the shock could have been lessened by a better preparation. But the event has been sudden, and so must be the information of it. We have lost an excellent father. His tenderness, who can do justice to? We all unite in love, and I am affectionately yours, Jane Austen.
The widow and the two daughters had virtually no income between them, and the 5 brothers of Jane Austen all made a contribution to keep the little household of 3 women going. But they did very much come down in the world. They then had to live in a series of rented rooms in Bath. No longer were able to afford a whole house, and that was a very much worse situation for them, lack of privacy and lack of social status, really. And so I think that was a very unhappy period of Jane Austen's life.
Now, when the Austens left Bath, which they eventually did, they moved to take lodgings in Southampton in 1806. The Austen ladies couldn't keep up a largish house by themselves. So after a time, they moved to Chawton in Hampshire, because Jane's brother, Edward Knight, as well as having his rich estate, Godmersham, in Kent, he also had another estate in Chawton. It just so happened that the estate bailiff, who used to live in that cottage, died, and the cottage became vacant. And this was decided to be very suitable for Mrs. Austen and her 2 daughters. It was on the Chawton estate, and Edward was spending more time in Chawton, and it was back in their beloved Hampshire. And as far as I can see, in fact, Chawton Cottage must have been quite like Steventon Parsonage.
She used to get up very early in the morning and practice the piano. The rest of the family weren't very musical, and this was supposed to be so that she didn't disturb them. In fact, knowing the house, I should imagine she woke them all up, because you hear everything in that house. And then she got the breakfast. That was her main chore if Cassandra was at home. If she were away, then Jane took over the housekeeping. And so Jane used to get the breakfast, and then after breakfast she used to stay in the dining parlour reading and writing all morning until lunchtime. And then in the afternoon they used to get their fresh air and exercise. She loved walking, but they couldn't afford a horse and carriage, rather like the Bennets. And they had the little donkey cart, and that was good enough to trundle into Alton to do the shopping or one of the neighbouring villages.
Her nephew talks about the creaking of a green baize swing door into the kitchen quarters, but somebody many years ago hung a notice on that door, and all our visitors absolutely love to try and make it creak, and sometimes it very obligingly does. It was just to let her know that somebody was coming in from outside, obviously not family, and it gave her time to pop her notes underneath her blotter and sit there studying her nails or something as if she wasn't actually writing. It was this privacy thing she didn't want everybody knowing. And so she did ask for it not to be oiled.
Henry is the brother who was closest to Jane, and I always regard him as the husband brother. He was close to her in age, and he and she had a special bond between them. In fact, he lived rather an unsatisfactory life. He kept sort of dashing off and joined the militia and became a banker and lost all his money, and fell in love with his widowed cousin, Eliza, who was 10 years older than him, and made this slightly surprising marriage to her. But he was a great support to Jane, and she would go and stay with him and Eliza in London.
Henry helped her to get Sense and Sensibility published, and that was published in 1811. It didn't have much stir or sale at first, but not so bad that it made a loss. It did make a slight profit, and this, thank goodness, encouraged her to go on writing and attempt to publish again. And she sold the copyright of what we now know as Pride and Prejudice, and this came out in 1813 and was the novel of the season. All the upper 10,000 were talking about it, and Henry, being what he was, a very proud brother, went round London saying, yes, it's my clever sister who wrote it, or words to that effect.
Jane Austen, when she'd finished Pride and Prejudice, went to London, and it showed she was still obsessed by her characters long after she'd finished the books, because she would go round a retrospective show of Joshua Reynolds looking for her heroines.
My dearest Cassandra, Henry and I went to the exhibition. I was very well pleased, particularly with a portrait of Mrs. Bingley, excessively like her. Size, shaped face, features and sweetness. She's dressed in a white gown with green ornaments, which convinces me of what I'd always supposed, that green was a favourite colour with her. But I'm disappointed, for there was nothing like Mrs. Darcy.
This is a Watteau, a lady at her toilet. Now, this is certainly Lydia Bennet. There she is, getting ready for her wedding with the naughty Mr. Wickham. And obviously terribly pleased with herself. She's soon going to be on her way home to triumph over all her unmarried sisters. Very Lydia there. Lovely.
So she continued writing, and we come to the two big novels, her maturity. Mansfield Park was written straight off, no previous efforts, no rehashing, no reworking. She wrote Mansfield Park in 1814, and having now had the successes, she went on writing. She wrote her other great novel, Emma, and when she went to London to stay with Henry to see about publishing this, they offered the text to John Murray.
She was like somebody writing a very, very good film script today. I think that she knew where to bring the characters in and where to take them off. She knew subtlety and she knew obviousness. And she could recognise when she'd done it that she'd produced something that really hadn't been done before. And no wonder people very quickly, including obviously the Prince Regent, but many others as well, simply loved it.
She was told of the Prince's interest in her books, and she went to Carlton House and must have had an extremely interesting and entertaining day there, and met Mr. Clark, the librarian, who conveyed to her the Prince Regent's wish that Emma should be dedicated to him. I think she did this with some reluctance. She didn't really approve of the Prince Regent, as we would imagine, but it was made clear to her that this really was a royal command. She wouldn't say no. This, of course, is the set, the three-volume novel, and here they are, which got the coat of arms inside. And we have the dedication here. And it reads, "To His Royal Highness, the Prince Regent, this work is by His Royal Highness's permission most respectfully dedicated by His Royal Highness's dutiful and obedient humble servant, the author." All the books really have the same basic plot. you know, of a woman looking for and finding the right mate, the right marriage. They end in marriage. It could be really almost a Mills and Boon type book, except one written by a genius. The women find their ultimate fulfillment through marriage. And although, of course, there is no overt sexual writing, there wouldn't be at that time, I feel that the sexual charge between the characters is there. I think she knew that she was a genius. I think she knew these books would last. But she must have been gratified because it was a mark of her established fame. That undoubtedly was important, but so was the pewter. It was the pewter that was going to save her from a penurious old age. I think it was in 1816 that two of her brothers were no longer able to pay, or felt they weren't able to pay, the £50 a year each, which they were paying to her mother. And when her uncle died, Lee Perrow, Mrs. Austen optimistically expected that as they had no children, that some of his money would come to her, and it didn't.
Having now had the successes, several in a trot, Jane started revising Northanger Abbey, and she also started composing and writing Persuasion. But she was then overtaken by her growing physical weakness, and she had some trouble in finishing, actually, Persuasion, because she was then going through a bout of illness. But she managed to get both Northanger Abbey and Persuasion finished in 1816. And she thought she was getting better. She felt rather better temporarily. She had a remission. And in 1817, she started what would have been a very, very funny novel, which is now known to us as Sanditon, which was going to be a rollicking romp about foolish people in a watering place. And one can see there were going to be all sorts of skirmishings among the young men and the young ladies as to who was going to pair off with who. And all we have left is 12 chapters, and in March 1817, she became too weak to continue. Because the local apothecary couldn't help her, she went to Winchester, where there was reputed to be a very good doctor whom they thought might be able to help. And in fact, of course, he couldn't.
Sunday, the 27th of April, 1817. I, Jane Austen, do by this, my last will and testament, give and bequeath to my dearest sister Cassandra Elizabeth everything of which I may die possessed, subject to the payment of my funeral expenses and to a legacy of £50 to my brother Henry.
Sir Zachary Cope wrote an article which we were allowed in the Jane Austen Society report to reprint from the British Medical Journal, describing her terminal illness as Addison's disease, which it could not have been called then because Addison hadn't been born to give his name to it. But it has a good many, not very serious, but distressing symptoms and varied ones. And it's an affection of the two little capsules, one on each side of your kidneys, called the adrenal capsules. And it finally, the patient finally dies from weakness and sickness. And what struck Sir Zachary Cope particularly was he'd seen it in patients, but he'd never seen it referred to in print, was that the colouring of the face is altered. And Jane Austen, writing to her niece Fanny Knight, said, "My face has been black and white and all manner of wrong colours." And that was what attracted Sir Zachary Cope's attention.
She bore up very well.
Very, very well, with immense courage, yes. And of course one is very sharply reminded of what it was like to die without the aid of drugs and so on. When her sister said, "Is there anything you want?" she said, "Nothing but death."
I'm ringing the tenor for someone who's died. Probably one of the dignitaries of the church, bishop, dean, canon of the cathedral. It probably wouldn't have been ringing for Jane Austen. She was relatively unknown as a writer, and of course didn't hold office in the cathedral in any way, although she just lived outside the close walls.
Incline us, O God, to think humbly of ourselves, to be severe only in the examination of our own conduct, to consider our fellow creatures with kindness, and to judge of all they say and do with that charity which we would desire from them ourselves.
Recently there was a claim that Jane Austen was an incestuous lesbian. What do you think of that?
Jane Austen?
Was an incestuous lesbian.
Well, if you'd like to set up a separate interview and if we could talk about that and nothing else, we might get down to it. But really, you do sometimes feel, and people can't get any stupider, and then I think Plato said you never get to the bottom of people's stupidity. You think you've done it, and then they come up with something that you wouldn't have expected even from them. It's not only groundless, but it's so totally ignorant.